The morning sun cast long shadows across the high school parking lot as families gathered for the graduation ceremony. Robert Martinez adjusted his old army dress uniform one more time, checking that his medals were properly aligned. The fabric felt different now, looser around his shoulders than it had been 30 years ago when he first wore it with pride. His daughter Sarah walked beside him, her heels clicking on the pavement. She kept glancing at her father with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Dad, you really didn't have to wear the uniform. Tommy would understand if you just came in regular clothes." Robert shook his head firmly. "My grandson is graduating today. This is important. I want to look proper for the photos." He paused, touching the purple heart on his chest. "Besides, this uniform means something. It represents the sacrifices made so kids like Tommy can get an education and follow their dreams." The gymnasium was already filling with excited families when they arrived. Rows of folding chairs faced a small stage decorated with the school colors. Balloons bobbed in the air conditioning, and the smell of coffee from the concession stand mixed with the nervous energy of proud parents. Robert found their seats in the middle section, his knees protesting as he settled into the metal chair. Around him, other families chatted excitedly, phones already out and ready to capture every moment. He noticed how everyone seemed so comfortable with technology now, while he still struggled to operate the camera on his phone. "I just want some good pictures of Tommy receiving his diploma," he told Sarah quietly. "That's all I need. Just a few clear shots to put on the mantle next to your graduation photo." Sarah squeezed his weathered hand. "We'll get plenty of pictures, Dad, don't worry about that." As the ceremony began, Robert tried to focus on the speakers, but his mind kept drifting. He thought about his own high school graduation, cut short by his decision to enlist right after turning 18. Vietnam was calling and young men were answering. He never got to walk across a stage like Tommy would today. The principal took the microphone and began calling names. Robert's heart swelled with pride as he watched other graduates receive their diplomas, knowing that soon it would be his grandson's turn. He fumbled with his phone, trying to get the camera ready, but the screen kept going dark. "Blast this thing," he muttered under his breath, pressing buttons randomly. A woman in front of him turned around and smiled sympathetically. "Technology can be tricky, can't it?" Robert nodded, embarrassed. He had survived jungle warfare and decades of manual labor, but a simple smartphone made him feel helpless. All he wanted was to capture this moment for Tommy, something the boy could look back on years from now and remember how proud his grandfather had been. The afternoon stretched on, and Robert's back began to ache from the uncomfortable chair. His uniform, which had felt so important that morning, now seemed to draw curious stares from younger parents who had no idea what the faded ribbons represented. Some looked at him with respect, others with polite confusion, and a few seemed to whisper among themselves. He caught fragments of conversations around him about college plans, summer vacations, and new cars for graduates. It reminded him how different this generation was from his own. These kids had opportunities he could never have imagined, chances to choose their futures instead of having them chosen by war and circumstance. When Tommy's name was finally called, Robert's hands shook as he tried to aim his phone at the stage. The letters blurred together on the screen, and he realized he had forgotten his reading glasses at home. Panic set in as he watched his grandson walk toward the diploma table, knowing this moment would pass in seconds and he might miss it entirely. "Sarah, can you?" He started to ask, but she was already recording with her own phone, tears of pride streaming down her face. Robert felt a deep frustration building inside him. Here was one of the most important moments in his family's life, and he couldn't even manage to take a simple photograph. The uniform that had once made him feel strong and capable now seemed like a costume from a different era, worn by an old man who couldn't keep up with the modern world. As Tommy shook hands with the principal and posed for the official photographer, Robert lowered his phone in defeat. He would have to rely on other people's pictures, just like he had learned to rely on other people for so many things as he aged. The independence he had fought so hard to maintain was slipping away, one small failure at a time. After the ceremony ended, families poured out of the gymnasium in a sea of caps, gowns, and camera flashes. Robert stood slowly, his joints stiff from sitting in the uncomfortable chair for over 2 hours. The excitement around him felt overwhelming as graduates hugged their friends and posed for countless photos with their families. Tommy bounded over to them, his graduation cap askew and his grin stretching from ear to ear. "Grandpa, did you see me walk across the stage? Did you get a good picture?" Robert's heart sank. He forced a smile and patted his grandson's shoulder. "I saw every second of it, son. You looked real professional up there." He avoided mentioning the pictures, hoping Sarah would handle that part. "Let's get some family photos by the school sign," Sarah suggested, sensing her father's discomfort. "The lighting is perfect over there." As they walked toward the designated photo area, Robert noticed other families already gathered there, taking turns posing in front of the school's brick sign. Professional photographers moved through the crowd, offering their services while parents juggled multiple phones and cameras to capture every angle. An elderly woman approached Robert with a warm smile. "Excuse me, young man," she said, looking at his uniform. "Thank you for your service. My husband was in the army too during Korea." Robert nodded respectfully. "Thank you, ma'am. It was an honor to serve." The woman studied his medals more closely. "Is that a Purple Heart? You must have some stories to tell." "A few," Robert replied quietly. He had learned long ago that most people didn't really want to hear the actual stories, just the sanitized versions that made them feel good about supporting the troops. Tommy overheard the conversation and looked at his grandfather with new curiosity. "Grandpa, you never really talk about the war stuff. Mom said you were a hero." Robert felt uncomfortable with the attention. "I wasn't any more of a hero than anyone else who served." "Tommy, we all did what we had to do." As they waited in line for photos, Robert watched the other families with their sophisticated cameras and natural ease with technology. A father nearby was using a tablet to take pictures while simultaneously live-streaming the event to relatives who couldn't attend. Another mother had a professional-looking camera with a lens longer than Robert's forearm. When their turn came, Sarah handed her phone to another parent and gathered the family together. "Okay, Dad, you stand next to Tommy. This is going to be such a great picture." Robert positioned himself beside his grandson, trying to stand straight despite the pain in his lower back. He had worn this uniform to dozens of military ceremonies over the years, but now it felt heavy and foreign. The younger generation around them seemed to move through life so effortlessly, while he felt like he was constantly catching up. "Can you take a few more?" Sarah asked the volunteer photographer. "My dad's phone wasn't working earlier, and we want to make sure we have good ones." The other parent, a woman about Sarah's age, smiled kindly. "Of course. Technology can be so frustrating sometimes." She took several shots from different angles, making sure to capture Robert's medals in the frame. As they finished with the photos, Tommy hugged his grandfather tightly. "Thanks for coming, Grandpa. It means a lot that you wore your uniform. All my friends think it's really cool that my grandfather is a war veteran." Robert felt a mix of pride and sadness. He was glad to make Tommy proud, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was becoming more of a symbol than a person to these young people. They saw the uniform and the medals, but they didn't understand the weight of the memories that came with them. The family began walking back toward the parking lot, joining the stream of graduates and their families heading to cars for the next round of celebrations. Robert moved slowly, letting the crowds pass around him. He noticed how everyone seemed to be heading somewhere else, to parties or dinners or other events that would extend this day's importance. "Are you coming to the restaurant with us, Dad?" Sarah asked, linking her arm through his. "Of course," Robert replied, though he was already feeling tired. "Wouldn't miss celebrating Tommy's big day." As they reached the car, Robert carefully removed his service cap and placed it on the dashboard. His reflection in the car window showed an old man in an old uniform, and for a moment he wondered if he had made the right choice wearing it. Perhaps he should have just come in regular clothes like most of the other grandparents, but then he remembered Tommy's face when he saw the uniform that morning, the way the boy's eyes had lit up with pride. Maybe that was enough. Maybe being there, showing up in the way he knew how, was what mattered most, even if he couldn't navigate the modern world as smoothly as he once could. The drive to the restaurant was filled with Tommy's excited chatter about his summer plans and the college courses he would be taking in the fall. Robert listened from the passenger seat, marveling at how different this young man's life would be from his own. No draft notices, no urgent calls to serve, just endless possibilities and choices. The family restaurant was bustling with other graduation parties when they arrived. Red, white, and blue decorations hung from the ceiling, and several tables were occupied by families still in their ceremony clothes. Robert felt more at ease here, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of a busy restaurant rather than the formal atmosphere of the school. They were seated at a corner booth, and Robert gratefully slid into the cushioned seat. His back had been aching since the ceremony, and the soft padding was a welcome relief from those metal folding chairs. Tommy sat across from him, still beaming with excitement, while Sarah settled in beside her son. "Order whatever you want, Tommy," Robert said, opening his menu. "This is your day." A young waitress approached their table, her eyes immediately drawn to Robert's uniform. "Thank you for your service, sir," she said respectfully before taking their drink orders. Robert nodded his appreciation, but he noticed how the thanks always came with a certain distance, as if people felt obligated to say the words but didn't quite know what they meant. He had grown accustomed to it over the years, this polite recognition that somehow made him feel more isolated rather than honored. As they waited for their food, other diners occasionally glanced over at their table. Robert could see them noticing his uniform, probably wondering what war he had fought in and what stories those medals represented. Some looked curious, others respectful, and a few seemed uncomfortable, as if his presence reminded them of things they preferred not to think about. "Grandpa, tell Tommy about when you got that medal," Sarah encouraged, pointing to the purple heart on his chest. Robert shifted uncomfortably. "That's not really dinner conversation, sweetheart." But Tommy leaned forward with genuine interest. "Come on, Grandpa. I've always wondered about your time in the Army. You never talk about it." Robert took a sip of his coffee, buying time. How could he explain to this bright, optimistic young man what it was really like? How could he describe the weight of memories that came with those pieces of colored ribbon and metal? "It was a different time, Tommy," he said finally. "We did what we had to do and we came home. That's the important part." The restaurant continued to buzz around them, filled with the sounds of celebration and family conversations. Robert noticed how easily the other families seemed to share their stories, their accomplishments, their plans for the future. Everything felt lighter for them, unburdened by the kind of experiences that made simple conversation complicated. Their food arrived, and the conversation shifted to safer topics like Tommy's summer job and his plans for college. Robert listened as his grandson talked about studying business, about internships and networking opportunities that would have been unimaginable when Robert was that age. "You know," Tommy said between bites, "my history teacher always said that veterans like you are living pieces of American history. She said we should ask more questions, learn more about what you guys went through." Robert felt a familiar tension in his chest. "Your teacher sounds like a good person, but some history is better left in the past." Sarah reached across the table and touched her father's hand. "Dad, you don't have to talk about anything you don't want to. We're just proud of you for serving." The word serving always sounded strange to Robert. It made what he had done sound noble and chosen, when the truth was much more complicated. He had been 18 years old, barely older than Tommy was now, when he found himself in a jungle on the other side of the world, doing things that still visited him in his dreams. As they finished their meal, Robert excused himself to use the restroom. Walking through the restaurant, he passed other tables filled with happy families celebrating their graduates. The contrast between their joy and his internal struggle made him feel like an outsider at his own grandson's celebration. In the bathroom mirror, he looked at himself again in the old uniform. The man staring back seemed tired, carrying invisible weight that had nothing to do with his age. He splashed cold water on his face and tried to shake off the melancholy that had been building all day. When he returned to the table, Tommy was showing Sarah something on his phone. "Look, Mom, I found some pictures from the ceremony that other parents posted online. There's Grandpa in his uniform." Robert felt a moment of panic. "Pictures where?" "On the school's social media page," Tommy explained excitedly. Mrs. Patterson took some great shots of all the families. "Look, you can see your medals really clearly in this one." Sarah smiled at the photos. "These are wonderful, Dad. You look so distinguished." Robert studied the images on Tommy's phone, seeing himself through other people's eyes. In the pictures, he looked like what people expected a veteran to look like. Proud, dignified, representing something larger than himself. But he felt the disconnect between that image and the reality of who he was inside. The afternoon was growing late, and other graduation parties were beginning to wrap up around them. Robert realized that soon they would go their separate ways. Tommy to celebrate with his friends, Sarah back to her own life, and Robert to his quiet apartment where the uniform would go back into the closet until the next important occasion. "We should probably head out," Sarah said, gathering her purse. "I know Tommy wants to meet up with his friends later." As they prepared to leave, Robert felt a strange mixture of pride and emptiness. He had accomplished what he set out to do. He had been there for Tommy's graduation, had worn his uniform with dignity, and had made his family proud. But something still felt unfinished, as if the day had raised more questions than it had answered. As they walked toward the restaurant exit, Robert noticed a man sitting alone at the bar area, also wearing a military uniform. This one was navy dress blues, crisp and perfectly fitted, with the bearing of someone who still served actively. The man appeared to be in his 30s, with the kind of confident posture that Robert remembered from his own younger days. The Navy man looked up as they passed, his eyes immediately going to Robert's uniform and then to his face with unmistakable recognition and respect. Robert nodded politely, the way veterans often acknowledged each other in public but kept walking with his family. "Dad, are you okay?" Sarah asked as they reached the parking lot. "You seem quiet." Robert paused beside their car, looking back toward the restaurant. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about how fast time goes by. Seems like yesterday you were graduating and now here's Tommy." Tommy was already texting his friends, making plans for the evening celebration that would continue without grandparents and dress uniforms. "Thanks for everything today, Grandpa. The uniform was really cool. All my friends' parents were impressed." After they said their goodbyes and Robert climbed into Sarah's car for the ride home, he found himself thinking about the young sailor in the restaurant. There had been something familiar in the man's eyes, a recognition that went beyond just military courtesy. It was the look of someone who understood the weight of service, both its honors and its burdens. During the drive, Sarah chatted about how well the day had gone and how proud she was of Tommy's achievements. Robert listened with half his attention while the other half drifted to memories of his own homecoming, when wearing the uniform had felt different. Back then it had represented survival and completion, the end of something rather than a symbol to be displayed at family events. When they reached his apartment building, Sarah walked him to the door. "Are you sure you're all right, Dad? You've seemed a little off since lunch." Robert kissed his daughter's cheek. "I'm just tired, honey. It's been a long day and I'm not as young as I used to be." As Sarah drove away, Robert climbed the stairs to his second-floor apartment, his knees protesting with each step. The hallway was quiet, most of his neighbors either at work or settled in for the evening. His apartment felt especially small after the day's festivities, filled with the kind of silence that made memories echo louder. He carefully hung the uniform in his closet, taking extra care with the medals and ribbons. Each piece represented something specific, moments in time that had shaped him in ways he was still understanding decades later. The Purple Heart caught the light from the overhead bulb, and for a moment he was transported back to a humid jungle where everything had changed in an instant. Robert made himself a cup of coffee and sat in his favorite chair by the window, looking out at the street below. Other families were probably still celebrating, sharing stories and making plans. While he sat alone with thoughts he couldn't easily share with anyone, his phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. "Thanks for making today so special. Dad, Tommy will never forget having his hero grandfather there." The word hero made him uncomfortable again. He typed back, "Glad I could be there. Love you both." As evening settled in, Robert found himself thinking about the young sailor again. There had been something in that brief moment of eye contact that suggested understanding, the kind that only came from shared experience. Most people looked at his uniform and saw a symbol, but other veterans saw the person underneath. He wondered what that young man's story was, what he had seen and done in service to his country. The newer generation of military personnel dealt with different challenges than Robert's generation had faced, but the fundamental experience of carrying responsibility for things larger than yourself remained the same. Robert pulled out an old photo album he kept on the side table, one filled with pictures from his Army days. Young faces stared back at him, men who had become brothers in circumstances none of them had chosen. Some had made it home, others hadn't, and all of them had been changed by the experience. He found a picture of himself in uniform, taken shortly after he had received the Purple Heart. The young man in the photograph looked confident and proud, but Robert could see something in his own eyes that hadn't been there in earlier pictures. It was the look of someone who had learned that the world could change in an instant, that safety was often an illusion, and that some responsibilities never ended. The apartment grew dark around him as Robert sat with the photo album, remembering not just the events of the day but the long journey that had brought him to this point. Tommy's graduation represented hope and possibility, the kind of future that his generation had fought to protect. But it also highlighted how different their worlds were, how the challenges he had faced seemed increasingly distant from the lives of people he loved most. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Robert checked the clock and realized it was after 8 in the evening. He wasn't expecting anyone, and visitors were rare in his building. Moving slowly to the door, he looked through the peephole and was surprised to see the young sailor from the restaurant standing in the hallway. Robert opened the door cautiously, surprised to find the young Navy man from the restaurant standing in his hallway. The sailor had changed out of his dress blues into civilian clothes, but his military bearing remained unmistakable. "I'm sorry to bother you, sir," the young man said respectfully. "I'm Petty Officer Marcus Webb. I was at the restaurant earlier and noticed your uniform. I asked the hostess if she knew which direction you headed, and I've been driving around looking for you." Robert stepped back, puzzled but curious. "That's quite an effort to go to, son. What can I do for you?" Marcus shifted nervously, as if he wasn't entirely sure why he had tracked down this older veteran. "I saw your Purple Heart and the other decorations, sir. I could tell you were Vietnam era. My grandfather served there too, and..." He paused, searching for the right words. "I guess I just felt like I needed to talk to someone who might understand." Robert studied the young man's face, recognizing something familiar in his expression. It was the look of someone carrying weight they couldn't easily share with civilian friends or family. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. "Coffee?" Marcus entered the small apartment, his eyes taking in the modest furnishings and the military memorabilia that Robert had accumulated over the years. "Thank you, sir. I don't want to impose." "No imposition," Robert said, moving to the kitchen. "Takes courage to track down a stranger. Must be something important on your mind." As Robert prepared the coffee, Marcus stood near the bookshelf studying the photographs and awards displayed there. "I just got back from my 3rd deployment," he said quietly. "Afghanistan. And today, watching you at that graduation ceremony, wearing your uniform with such dignity." He trailed off. Robert returned with 2 cups of coffee and settled into his chair, gesturing for Marcus to take the sofa. "Afghanistan's been a long war. How are you holding up?" Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully. "That's just it, sir. I don't really know. Everyone keeps thanking me for my service, treating me like some kind of hero, but I don't feel like one. I feel like I'm pretending to be something I'm not." The honesty in the young man's voice struck Robert deeply. "What makes you think you're pretending?" "Because heroes don't have nightmares," Marcus said, staring into his coffee cup. "Heroes don't wake up in cold sweats thinking about things they've seen or done. Heroes don't feel guilty about coming home when others didn't." Robert felt a familiar tightness in his chest. These were thoughts he had carried for decades, feelings he had never been able to articulate to his own family. "Who told you that heroes don't have nightmares?" Marcus looked up, surprised by the question. "I don't know. That's just how everyone acts. Like we're supposed to be these strong, unbreakable figures who represent American values and courage." "And you think that's what I looked like today at that graduation?" Robert asked gently. "Yes, sir. You looked like you had it all figured out. Like wearing that uniform was natural and comfortable for you." Robert almost laughed, but it came out as more of a sigh. "Son, I spent half that ceremony struggling to work my phone camera and feeling like a relic from another era. I wore that uniform because I wanted to honor my grandson's achievement, but I felt like I was wearing a costume from someone else's life." Marcus set down his coffee cup, leaning forward with interest. "Really? But you looked so composed, so sure of yourself." "Appearances can be deceiving," Robert said. "You want to know the truth? I still have nightmares about Vietnam. I still wake up sometimes thinking I'm back in that jungle, and I still feel guilty about things that happened 50 years ago." The admission hung in the air between them, creating a space where honesty felt possible. Marcus nodded slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place. "My grandfather never talked about Vietnam. He died when I was young, but my grandmother said he had bad dreams sometimes." "A lot of us did," Robert confirmed. The difference was, back then, nobody talked about it. We were supposed to come home and pretend it never happened. You guys at least have people trying to understand what you've been through. Marcus ran his hands through his hair. But that's almost worse sometimes. Everyone wants to help, but they don't really understand. They want to fix us or celebrate us, but they can't just let us be regular people dealing with difficult experiences. Robert felt a profound recognition of this struggle. You're right. The hero worship can be its own kind of burden. People want you to represent something larger than yourself, but that doesn't leave much room for being human. Exactly, Marcus said with relief. Today, watching you with your family, I thought maybe you had found a way to balance it all. To be both the veteran everyone expects and the person you actually are. Robert considered this for a moment. I'm still working on that balance, son. Some days are better than others. Today was complicated because I wanted to be present for my grandson, but I also felt like I was performing a role that didn't quite fit anymore. Marcus nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. So how do you handle it? The expectations, the memories, the feeling like you're supposed to be someone you're not. Robert looked around his small apartment, thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. I try to remember that service means different things at different times. When I was young, it meant being willing to fight. Now it means being willing to live with the consequences of that fighting, and to find ways to honor what we've experienced without being defined by it. The two men sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the evening had settled into full darkness, and the sounds of the neighborhood created a peaceful backdrop to their conversation. Can I ask you something? Marcus said finally. Of course. Do you think it gets easier? Carrying all of this? Robert smiled sadly. It doesn't get easier, but it gets different. You learn to carry it better. And sometimes, like tonight, you find someone else who understands the weight. Marcus stayed for another hour, and their conversation drifted from the weight of service to lighter topics. Robert found himself talking about Tommy's graduation plans and his pride in his grandson's achievements. Marcus shared stories about his younger sister, who was starting college in the fall and had no idea what she wanted to study. It's funny, Marcus said. When I see young people like your grandson or my sister, I feel protective of their innocence. They get to worry about normal things like college majors and summer jobs. That's what we fought for, right? So they could have those choices. Robert nodded thoughtfully. That's part of it. But I've learned that protecting their innocence doesn't mean we have to pretend our experiences didn't happen. Tommy asked me about my medals today, and I deflected the question because I didn't want to burden him with difficult truths. How do you think he would have reacted if you had been honest with him? I don't know, Robert admitted. Maybe better than I expected. Kids today seem more aware of the complexity of the world than we were at their age. Maybe they can handle more truth than we give them credit for. As the evening progressed, Marcus began to open up about his own struggles with returning to civilian life. He talked about the difficulty of maintaining relationships when you carried experiences that were hard to explain. He mentioned feeling disconnected from friends who had never served, and the challenge of dating when every conversation felt like it required him to either hide important parts of himself or overwhelm people with information they couldn't process. The isolation is the hardest part, Marcus said. Even when I'm surrounded by people, I feel like I'm watching life through glass. Like everyone else is living in color while I'm stuck in black and white. Robert understood this feeling intimately. After I came back from Vietnam, I spent years feeling like I was watching other people live normal lives that I could never access. It took me a long time to realize that normal isn't a place you arrive at. It's something you create as you go. How did you create it? Robert thought about his marriage to Sarah's mother, which had ended partly because of his inability to communicate about his war experiences. He thought about the years of hard work and quiet suffering, the gradual process of building a life that could accommodate both his memories and his hopes. Slowly, he said finally, I made a lot of mistakes along the way. I thought I could compartmentalize everything, keep the war stuff separate from the rest of my life. But that doesn't work. It all bleeds together eventually. Marcus leaned back into the sofa, looking more relaxed than he had when he first arrived. My therapist keeps telling me that integration is the goal, not forgetting or moving on. But I'm not sure what that looks like practically. Integration, Robert repeated, testing the word. I like that better than getting over it or moving on. Those phrases always made it sound like the experience should disappear completely. Exactly. like we're supposed to erase parts of ourselves to make other people comfortable. Robert stood up and walked to his bookshelf, pulling out the photo album he had been looking at earlier. Want to see something? Marcus joined him at the bookshelf as Robert opened the album to a particular page. This is me receiving the Purple Heart. I was 20 years old and I thought this moment would define the rest of my life. Marcus studied the photograph carefully. You look so young, but also older than your years, if that makes sense. It does. That's what combat does to you. It ages you in ways that have nothing to do with time. Robert turned the page to show more recent photos. This is from last year's Veterans Day parade. Same uniform, same medals, but a completely different person wearing them. You look more peaceful in the recent photo, Marcus observed. It took 45 years to get to that peace, Robert said. And it's not constant. Some days are still hard, but I've learned that the goal isn't to eliminate the difficult feelings, it's to make room for other feelings alongside them. Marcus nodded, studying both photographs. Can I ask what happened? How you got the Purple Heart? Robert closed the album gently.
Shrapnel from a mortar attack.
I was lucky. Others in my unit weren't. For years, I felt guilty about surviving when they didn't. I felt like I didn't deserve the recognition because I had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. How did you work through the guilt? I'm still working through it, Robert said honestly. But I've learned that guilt isn't necessarily something you cure. It's something you learn to carry responsibly. I try to honor the memory of the men who didn't come home by living a life that's worthy of their sacrifice. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing this perspective. I never thought about it that way. I've been trying to figure out how to stop feeling guilty about surviving, but maybe the guilt isn't the problem. Maybe not. Maybe the problem is feeling like you have to carry it alone. The conversation was interrupted by Robert's phone buzzing with a text message. He glanced at it and smiled. It's from Tommy. He's sending me pictures from his graduation party with his friends. Marcus looked at the photos over Robert's shoulder. He looks happy. Really happy, he is. And that happiness exists because of choices we made and sacrifices we accepted. That doesn't erase the difficulty of our experiences, but it gives them meaning. As Marcus prepared to leave, he turned back to Robert with gratitude clear in his expression. Thank you for letting me come up here tonight. I was feeling pretty lost after seeing you at the restaurant, and I'm not sure why I felt compelled to find you, but I'm glad I did. Robert walked him to the door. Sometimes we need to see that we're not alone in carrying difficult things. You helped me tonight too by reminding me that sharing our stories doesn't diminish us, it connects us. Marcus paused in the doorway. Would it be okay if I came back sometime? Maybe we could talk more about finding that balance you mentioned. I'd like that, Robert said sincerely. And Marcus? You don't have to figure everything out at once. Integration takes time. 3 weeks later, Robert found himself standing in front of his closet, looking at the army dress uniform hanging next to his everyday clothes. This time he wasn't preparing for a special occasion. Marcus had invited him to speak at a support group meeting for returning veterans, and Robert had surprised himself by saying yes. The drive to the community center gave him time to think about how much had changed since Tommy's graduation. Marcus had visited twice more, and their conversations had helped Robert see his own experiences from a different perspective. The younger veteran's willingness to be vulnerable had inspired Robert to consider sharing his story more openly. The meeting room was smaller than Robert had expected, with about 15 veterans of various ages seated in a circle of folding chairs. Marcus introduced him to the group leader, a woman named Dr. Chen who had a warm smile and an immediate way of making people feel welcome. We're honored to have Robert here tonight, Marcus told the group. He's taught me a lot about carrying our experiences with dignity rather than shame. Robert felt nervous as he took his seat in the circle. These men and women represented different conflicts in different generations, but he could see familiar expressions on their faces. Some looked guarded, others hopeful, and a few seemed to be fighting internal battles that played out in their eyes. I'm not sure I have any wisdom to offer, Robert began, his voice steadier than he felt. But Marcus thought it might be helpful to hear from someone who's been carrying these experiences for a while. An older woman across the circle spoke up. How long is a while? 52 years next month, Robert replied. Vietnam, 1972 to 1973. A younger man, probably in his 20s, leaned forward with interest. Do you still think about it? The war, I mean. Robert considered the question carefully. Every day. But not in the same way I did 20 years ago or even 5 years ago. The memories don't hurt less, but they hurt differently. They've become part of the story of who I am rather than the entire story. Dr. Chen nodded encouragingly. Can you tell us more about that distinction? For a long time, I thought I was either a victim of my war experiences, or I had to pretend they didn't affect me at all. It took me decades to realize there was a third option. I could be someone who had been shaped by difficult experiences, but wasn't defined solely by them. A woman in her 30s raised her hand tentatively. How do you explain that to people who haven't served? My family keeps telling me to move on, but they don't understand that it's not that simple. Robert felt a deep empathy for her struggle. That's one of the hardest parts. People want to help, but they often try to fix us or rush us through a process that doesn't have a timeline. I've learned to be more honest about what I need from the people who love me. What does that look like practically? Marcus asked. Well, just last week, my daughter Sarah asked me again about my medals. This time, instead of changing the subject, I told her that I was proud of my service, but that some of the stories were difficult to share. I asked if she could be patient with me while I figured out how to talk about things I'd kept private for so long. How did she react? The younger man asked. Better than I expected. She said she didn't need to know everything, but she wanted to understand enough to support me better. We're taking it slowly, but it feels more honest than the silence I've maintained for decades. Dr. Chen smiled. That sounds like a beautiful example of setting boundaries while staying connected. Robert nodded. I'm still learning. Marcus has helped me realize that vulnerability doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. And people can't support us if we don't let them see who we really are. The conversation continued for another hour, with different group members sharing their own struggles and insights. Robert found himself moved by their courage in facing their experiences head-on. And he realized that this generation of veterans had resources and support systems that his generation had never had access to. As the meeting ended, several people approached Robert to thank him for sharing his perspective. The young woman who had asked about explaining things to family members lingered after the others left. Can I ask you something personal? She said. Of course. Do you think it's possible to have a normal family life while dealing with all of this? I'm engaged and I'm scared that my issues will ruin my relationship. Robert thought about his own failed marriage and the years of loneliness that had followed. I made a lot of mistakes with relationships because I thought I had to handle everything alone. If I could do it over, I would have been more honest about my struggles and more willing to accept help. Your fiancé loves you, right? She nodded. Then give them the chance to love all of you, including the parts that are healing. Don't make the decision for them about what they can and can't handle. As Robert drove home that evening, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. A sense of purpose that wasn't tied to performance or appearance. Sharing his story had been difficult, but it had also been meaningful in a way that wearing his uniform to formal events had never been. When he reached his apartment, he found a text message from Tommy. Mom told me you spoke at a veterans meeting tonight. That's really cool, Grandpa. Maybe sometime you could tell me some of your stories? Robert smiled as he typed back. I'd like that, Tommy. How about this weekend? For the first time in decades, Robert felt ready to let the people who loved him see not just the uniform and the medals, but the person who wore them. The integration that Marcus had talked about was beginning to feel possible, one honest conversation at a time. He hung up his civilian clothes and looked once more at the dress uniform in his closet. Tomorrow he would call the local high school to ask if they needed any guest speakers for their history classes. Maybe it was time to share the stories behind the medals, not just the symbols themselves. The uniform would always represent his service, but now it could represent something more. The ongoing choice to transform difficult experiences into wisdom that could help others. That felt like a different kind of heroism, one that didn't require perfection or invulnerability, just the courage to be authentic about both the costs and the gifts of service.